Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. And today is a book club episode with Dominick Hernandez. We're talking about his new book published by Baker Academic, Engaging the Old Testament, How to Read Biblical Narrative, Poetry, and Prophecy Well. So there is a link in our show notes. If you click on it, it'll take you to Baker Academic and straight to that book so you can get it for yourself. And there was, for book club episodes, if I find an endorsement of a guest we've had on our show before, and they wrote an endorsement for a book that we're doing, then I read it. And so Tom Schreiner, he wrote an endorsement for Dominick's book, and I'll read it right now. Tom Schreiner says this about the book: reading and interpreting the Old Testament is a daunting task since the writings are over 2,000 years old and since they come from a culture dramatically different from ours. Hernandez provides expert guidance in understanding narrative, poetry, and prophecy. Hernandez wisely admonishes us to read the biblical text slowly, and the book is stocked with examples where the author has clearly followed his own dictum. This is not an ordinary textbook because it not only provides wise guidance for beginners, but also offers bold interpretations that will provoke the most experienced reader to reflect anew on the biblical text. This is an ideal textbook for both new students and for those who want something fresh and challenging. So I will let Peter further introduce Dominick Hernandez today.
Yeah, we have Dr. Dominick Hernandez, who's Associate Professor of Old Testament and Semitics at Talbot School of Theology, Biola University. If you guys know, this is my alma mater in La Mirada, California. Previously taught at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, Moody Bible Institute, and Israel College of the Bible. Hernandez preaches and gives seminars and is the author of 4 books. He also has served in English, Spanish, and Hebrew language ministries in the U.S. and abroad. It's a pleasure having you on the show, Dr. Hernandez.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. It's an honor to be with you.
Of course, yeah. So the first question is not on the list I sent, but I'm assuming nobody knows this about you besides those who know you, is you are a Spanish speaker who also speaks fluent Hebrew. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so let's say 15 or 16 years ago, I went into a school of ministry, and the school of ministry had a professor there that studied at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And immediately, that professor helped me understand how closely modern Hebrew and biblical Hebrew were related. It's something that I didn't expect, to be honest with you. Going into the school, I was expecting a sort of a very, deductive approach where you learn, like you learn biblical languages in many seminaries, right? You learn the rules, and then you try to put the rules together. And this professor taught in a way that expected the students to learn inductively.
Yep.
And as a result of that, I started to fall in love not only with biblical Hebrew, but with modern Hebrew at the same time. And so several years later, when it came time to apply for the PhD, I applied to Bar Ilan University in the Tel Aviv metropolitan area in Israel, was accepted and moved there and lived in Israel for 5 years with my family, and that's when the modern Hebrew really picked up.
So that kind of covers, but maybe to go a little bit more in depth to our first real question is, for those who don't know you, don't know your work, and don't know what you do, maybe provide a little bit of background on yourself, your work, and all that fun stuff.
Well, yeah, so couple of other sort of tidbits, and that is been married for 20 years with Gabby, who's from Mexico. I'm Puerto Rican, so my family is from Puerto Rico.
What part of Mexico is she from?
She's from Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico.
Okay,
She's a Tapatilla.
Yep.
So we met in Puerto Rico when we were studying at the University of Puerto Rico. We've been married for 20 years. We have 2 children. My family's from Puerto Rico. She is from Mexico. We met in Puerto Rico. We moved stateside. We got married. Have 2 children. And one of our children was born in North America, but then we moved immediately to Israel. And the other one was born in Israel, and we moved then back to North America. And so I tend to tell people when I speak in congregations or even introduce myself to my classes that we don't have a passport that has any country, but rather we have a passport that just says confused across the front, because that's basically who we are at this point. But so that's a little bit of the family makeup. Got very interested in Old Testament, as I shared very briefly with you at the School of Ministry that I went to, and then ultimately began working as a professor of Old Testament, and I'm currently an associate professor of Old Testament and Semitics at Talbot, as you said. Mostly interested in Semitic philology, though I do think that people that do things like Semitic philology need to distill their work for people that are just lovers of the Bible, right? Not just lovers of the Bible, but lovers of the Bible.
Yep.
And so some of my work, I think, reflects that. But I love Semitics is really what I love to study in my spare time.
Awesome.
I'd like to know, in your household, how was watching the World Baseball Classic with Mexico and Puerto Rico?
That's right. Yeah, Israel, Mexico versus the U.S. You're like, oh my gosh.
Israel, Puerto Rico. Yeah.
A couple of things. So we could have rooted for several teams. We live in North America, obviously, so we could have rooted for the U.S. Yep. My wife is from Mexico. She didn't really follow baseball until the World Baseball Classic happened.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Obviously, I'm diehard Puerto Rico, right?
Yeah.
But
Of course.
my children have this connection to Israel.
Yeah.
And so when Israel was playing, especially when they beat Nicaragua, that was a pretty, even though we're Spanish speakers, we're Latinos, we were very prideful. We were very proud that many of our North American Jewish friends that play baseball, as well as the Israelis, were happy that day. So, but no, in my mind and heart, there was no crisis of conscience. I was 100% rooting for Puerto Rico and 100% pride when Mexico.
I was about to say, they got upset by Mexico. Yeah.
Sorry, I brought that up.
Still sort of crying. So if we want to keep talking about this, we might want to end this interview now.
That's right.
Sorry I brought that up, but I had to know, man.
Right.
Yeah, and then USA put a pounding. Oh my gosh! And then they got beat by Japan. But
that was a great. The World Baseball Classic is amazing.
Best thing that ever happened for professional baseball, I think.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I think 2020. I mean, those who are waiting for all this Old Testament stuff, we'll get there. But the World Baseball Classic, like I feel, because I've watched every single one since 2006. Yeah. Because I was play baseball, huge baseball fan. I played baseball at Biola. But it was there was something different about 23. That was not true really of the previous four. I'm not really sure what it was, or previous four.
It was just a constant buzz, constant excitement.
It really was, yeah.
Every single pitch felt like it was important. Every single out felt like it was important. It was just and lots of the best players from these countries played. And the talent has been,
that's really evenly distributed, more so.
Yeah. So just think about the Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic have always been powerhouses, but Venezuela is a major baseball power. Right? So anyway, you're right. We could continue to talk about this instead of the Old Testament stuff if we want.
One more plug.
How about this? We'll intersperse it. We'll like seventh inning stretches.
But I mean, one more plug about that. It's amazing to see some of the countries that you normally would not think that baseball really got into, like Israel and Italy and Czech Republic. Some of these countries are like, in the UK even, and you're like, they're playing. They have actually a baseball squad.
It's a really good thing, I think. It's a really good thing for the game.
Everybody thought they were playing soccer, and they went to the field like, they're playing baseball there. That's right.
So switching that over from making the baseball around the world into every country will make the gospel around the world in every country.
Oh, look at that transition.
Bridge this in. And so into my first question, switching gears, we'll see how good I do. So talking about the Old Testament, obviously, a lot of Christians have a difficult time even getting into the Old Testament to begin with. I think a lot of churches kind of default is like, hey, don't even worry about the Old Testament. Let's just talk about the New Testament. There's a lot of problems with that, obviously, that mindset. So the Old Testament is very important for a lot of reasons. But if people did pick the Old Testament, they really hang their hat on the Psalms. They're easier to digest. They feel applicable. They're fun to read. Sometimes the more direct messianic prophecies that are prominent in the New Testament can, feel less foreign, and the list goes on. So those are some examples of maybe like easier go-to ones. But in general, though, why do you think the Old Testament is harder for Christians to read and fully engage with?
Yeah. So I think that this answer can be, or this question can be answered in one word in the plural, and then we can nuance it. And that's distances. So distance, right? We as Christian people believe that Jesus, the Messiah, is the ultimate culmination of the work of God. That is, Jesus is the perfect reflection, we read in Hebrews, of God Almighty. We believe that He's Creator God, right? We believe, and we also recognize, and that is more outlined for us, or more clearly outlined for us on the pages of the New Testament. Also, we do believe that there are other doctrines that are very distinctly Christian doctrines that are outlined for us on the pages of the New Testament. The doctrine of salvation, for example, more clearly outlined. How about this? The doctrine of what happens in eternity, more clearly outlined on the pages of the New Testament. These are all fundamental Christian doctrines that are very clearly outlined on the pages of the New Testament. So we go to a Christian church, we hear some of these things spoken about, and we have a sense of affinity immediately, sort of with the language that's being spoken about in the pages of the New Testament. It in terms of distance, that is, with sort of theological concepts, we're much closer to that, right? It's much closer to us even in time. There are these distances that are close, or they're easier to bridge the gap between distances that we do have with the New Testament. With the Old Testament, we're not talking per se about for example, we don't have very clearly outlined doctrines of salvation. We don't have very clearly outlined doctrines of many Christian things that we talk about in our Christian churches. Instead, we have things like levirate marriage. Like, levirate marriage? Like, are you serious? That's weird to us, right?
Yeah.
Well, right. Think about some of the other things that are sort of weird to us in the Old Testament. Some of the laws that we encounter. Yeah. We see God portrayed in sort of weird ways. Where on the pages of the New Testament we see God is love, right? And God is ultimately manifested the person and the work of Jesus. On the pages of the Old Testament, sometimes He's depicted as sort of an angry God, with His audible voice from the heavens. I mean, there are these distances, theological distances. There's distances in language. There's distances in cultures. There are differences that we have a difficult time bridging. And so for Christian people that believe that God fulfilled His work through the person and the work of Jesus the Messiah, many times it's simpler, it's easier, we feel like it's better to view the culmination and everything else sort of as a sort of an add-on to the culmination. But the major problem with that, as I get about early in the book, is that does not do justice to what many Christians actually believe about the Scriptures.
Oh yeah,
they are all equally the very Word of God.
Yeah, maybe our theoretical doctrine is everything's inspired. We look at 2 Timothy, we look at 1 Timothy, we look at Paul's pastoral epistles, all that stuff, how Jesus engaged with the Old Testament. But then practically, I think the last study I saw was like, if you go to your average church, it's something like 5% of them are preaching from the Old Testament that given day. And then obviously 95% are from the New Testament. So it's like, is our doctrine really that filled out if that's what we believe?
And 95% of those, if they're Presbyterian churches, are preaching from Romans or Galatians.
That's right. Yeah, all of Paul's epistles. Yeah, the Gospels kind of get left out, and Romans 9 becomes really like working for us pretty hard.
I got kind of like a natural question that came up based on what you're saying, and then I remember you were talking about your journey. And you spent some time in Israel too. So, and we're obviously talking about the Old Testament. So, just curiosity, when you were, had your time in Israel, you made a lot of friends, obviously that are, Jewish friends. Did you, when you were talking to them and possibly evangelizing to them, did you, or how did you kind of bring up the Old Testament that we both share with our Jewish friends to kind of kind of guide them into, our Christian outlook on the New Testament.
Right. So when you live in a place, so sometimes we think about places in the Middle East or places, I'm not sure what your experience has been, gentlemen, in terms of your travel, but we think of these far places as places that we would go maybe once or twice in a lifetime. We're kind of disconnected from the people that would live there. Even many Christians that go to Israel never actually engage with any Israelis, right? So it's sort of in the abstract, we would think maybe if we were there, it would be something like church oriented or Christian oriented or a tour or something like that. But when you're living in a place, just like you gentlemen live, in this greater Southern California area, the things that go on in conversations really revert to, we have basic conversations with people. So here's what I'm getting at with that.
Yeah.
And that is, I made genuine friends with my Israeli friends. They became my real friends.
Yeah.
And they became my real friends. And we talked about all the mundane things that you would talk about with real friends. But they knew that I was a Christian person. This is not something that you should, or really in many, I would say, especially in Israel, you cannot hide this. You have to let people know who you are, because you can't let people think that you're trying to pull the wool over their eyes. You have to let them know distinctly who you are. And if they're interested in learning more about who you are and what you believe, then that will lead to very natural conversations, especially as it relates to the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. If you sort of hide that about yourself, you're going to have a difficult time making friends anywhere. So I guess we could say, strategy is to be a real person, like go and make friends. And if people are interested in talking about the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, specifically a Christian reading of that, I'd be happy to talk about that. Let's talk about it right now. Let's have a coffee. If they're not interested, we can still be friends. Let's be friends.
Yeah. Yeah, they're not potential projects. They're people that you want to be friends with.
And lots of these people, lots of the people that I'm thinking of right now are still very good, even family friends, people that we would say that we have a deep affection for, that would not necessarily accept my readings of the Old Testament, but would be happy to talk to me about it or talk with me about it.
Cool.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was just curious question. So in the book, you give 4 examples in the beginning of this book for a better and deeper engagement of the Old Testament. What are they, and can you give a brief explanation of each and their importance to our reading? Could you
define what you mean by brief? Oh, professor. All right, whatever.
It's subjective.
Yeah.
So a couple of things. I started off writing this book. This book was supposed to be something like a basic guide to the Old Testament. And I started writing it. And I was like, I kind of don't want to write that book. And here's why. Because many of my students have like a decent amount of info about the Old Testament, specifically if they're Christians and they come from a Christian, like they know the basics, right? They know there's an Israel, they know there was a Judah. They might not know the details, but they know names of the books and stuff. But lots of the basic info that you can get from about ancient Israel, you can get in a good study Bible, right? So you can read the study Bible notes, or you can read. You mentioned Logos. Logos has good notes you can read.
Yep.
All right. So as I started writing the book, I realized that my students, what they needed most help with, and what I need most help with, and I would say generally speaking, what we need most help with is how to engage texts well, how to be good readers of text, not just getting more information, but what to do with that information, and how to engage a text so that we're perceiving the information that the authors may have wanted to communicate. All right, that wasn't brief, but I hope that that's helpful, because
that's pretty thick and brief for what we're used to. You'd be surprised about the brief answers we get that are 15 minutes long.
Okay, so that was 1 minute out of my 15-minute answer. Now here comes the next 14 minutes, and the next 14 minutes starts with this. As I read, I started thinking about, okay, like how can I encourage myself? Right? This is it's just being honest. What can I do to be a better reader of the Bible? We read this Bible over and over and over again because we believe that we can actually become better readers of the text. We believe that all of us can continue to be better readers. The first thing that I said is that we have to read humbly. Why? Because, well, first of all, in the biblical text, it's just a superficial reading of the book of Proverbs, let's say, for example, people that aren't teachable are the sort of the example of being idiots, right? Like if you're not teachable,
Yeah.
if you think you know everything, you're actually the idiot in the Bible, especially in
Uh-huh.
the book of Proverbs. Maybe they don't use the word idiot, but the Proverbs say something like that.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
humbly, we have to read humbly. Like we have to be ready for what we read to actually change what we believe, right? The second thing, and we have to just be teachable. The second thing is we have to read successively. You might think like, oh, successive meanings that you start with Genesis or you start with John, you go all the way through. That's not what I'm saying. What successive reading is, it doesn't necessarily mean that you start at the beginning of the Bible or even at the beginning of a book, but it means that you have to consider that where you're reading in terms of a succession of revelation being revealed, right? So we have to recognize that we're discovering information about God and about God's plans little by little in the text. We don't get everything at one time. And that helps us recognize not only what's being portrayed or interpret what's being portrayed in a specific text, but also helps us recognize that, we are permitted to receive. We're best interpreters when we recognize that we're interpreting in a specific period along this sort of, this history of salvation.
Yeah.
Not every passage is the culmination of what the Bible says about a specific topic.
Yeah.
So we have to recognize that. Also, we have to read entirely, which means we should read things in their entire biblical context. We
Amen.
Yeah. We have a difficult time with this very naturally, and so we just need to be encouraged to do this. Why do we have a difficult time? Practically, it's difficult to read entire books of the Bible. Practically, it's difficult to read the entire Bible in a reasonable amount of time so that you remember the details of what you started reading a couple months ago, right? It's just difficult. But we also have to recognize that the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, makes references even across books. It's intended to be read in its context, in the context of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. So we have to read the entire thing, and we can't be dogmatic just about a particular section, but rather have to we have to read everything within its entire context.
Yep.
All right, and then the last point, and this is actually what the book focuses on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Reading deliberately. So what is reading deliberately? We have to be intentional as readers of slowing down the process of reading. You notice how I slowed down on that?
Yeah.
The reason why I slowed down on that, it was an object lesson or something like that. People hate doing things slowly.
Mm-hmm.
They're even getting annoyed listening now. Because I was just speaking really fast. I live in the northeast of the U.S., so I speak fast.
Yeah.
But and you hear by the accent. But people don't, especially Christians, if they think they can get more info, if they do something faster and read it a larger quantity of thing, like if they can get it. Okay, so I'm into reading the entirety of the Bible. I just said it. I'm also into reading or slowing down so that we can pay special attention to what the biblical writers were trying to communicate in order to provoke a response from their authorship. From their readership. Mm-hmm. We have to slow down in order to pay attention to the genius of the biblical writers. What were they doing in the text? Not just what were they communicating, right, in terms of information, but what were they doing in the text in order to provoke a response from the readership? And by reading deliberately, we're able to get close to that, to figure those types of details out.
Yeah, because reading slowly probably matches up more closely with how they orally heard it as well, because people spoke it probably in a way like this so people could hear it and understand it clearly versus just rattling it off real fast.
Rewind and go fast forward. You just listen.
Honestly, I think different sections of the Old Testament were communicated in different ways. So there was probably some of it that was sung. There was some, but what we have, one of the goals of this book is to get contemporary readers to engage with texts well, because we actually believe, so sort of We would say something like this in many of our churches. We believe that the written text of the Bible is that which is inspired, right?
Yep.
We would say something like that. So what is it that we have to study in order to glean, right, the contemporary messages that are inspired? And that's the words of the text. It's the words that we believe are inspired. It's the words that we believe have the power and the authority, right? It's the words that contain the message that we are to apply to our lives. It's the very words. So for me, I'm trying to do my best in this book to help readers of the Bible work with the words the best way possible.
Yeah, and maybe to bridge into my next question, to kind of give it some context, because you start off each chapter with like a little bit of a quote, maybe a few sentences, and then you dive into it. It's not just a quote and then like let's move on to something else. It's actually engage with that and show how is the reading of this, or how is the author using this likened to whatever biblical narrative or genre I'm in whatsoever. So maybe what are you doing with kind of classical literature, you can call it, like kind of classics of English literature, that you're trying to teach readers to do with the Bible?
All right, so let me ask you this question. It's not a quiz, Peter. Let me ask you this question, though. You ever read The Hobbit?
I have.
The Hobbit is a most excellent book, isn't it?
It is a very good book. Yep.
And it's even better like when you read it aloud and you give, everybody.
It was read aloud to me as a kid. Yep.
This is what I did to my children with my children, right? I read The Hobbit aloud, like amazing. All right, let me ask you this. You have to answer this.
Okay.
Who do you think is a more inspired, divinely inspired author? Tolkien? Nope. Tolkien or Isaiah, the prophet? Answer the question, please.
Isaiah.
Right answer. This is a Sunday school answer. You must have been in Awana, right? But who's all right? So let me ask you this: who do you think we should read more closely, Tolkien or Daniel?
Daniel.
All right, good answer. Rhetorical questions. But here's the point. Many times we think that reading the Old Testament should be done or Bible reading in general, should be done in such a way that separates the Bible from other excellent literature. And in actuality, what I'm trying to do in this book is to say, we should read the Bible as if it were at least other excellent literature, right? So we take books like The Lord of the Flies, which I make reference to, and The Hobbit, which I make reference
Scarlet Letter, a few other ones, yep.
The Scarlet Letter that I make reference to, exactly. Several of these other books that I make reference to. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say these very talented authors did these types of things. They utilized these aesthetic devices. They utilized imagery. They utilized metaphor. They set the reader up in this way. Why wouldn't the biblical writers do at least what they did? And even maybe in better ways? So it's a bit of ironic reading sometimes what we as contemporary Christians fall into. We have such a reverence for the Bible that we say, no, I can't read it as if it were just another book. And in that, they're under-reading. We are under-reading. Because we have to read it as if it were at least any other book, but it's even more than that.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That helps kind of this next one. So we'll kind of go through genre is like the wrong way to say it, but like kind of not textual difference. We'll get there. The word's not coming to me, but what tends to be so difficult, because I'm thinking Bible reading plans, and people are far past this now, hopefully. But when we get to ceremonially heavy texts like tent texts and sacrificial texts, and you do this with this, you build this here, this guy does this there, and a lot of Christians, like you said, the distance from this is like, we have nothing like this today. How do I read this well as a Christian, but also just reading these texts better?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that I think need to be ironed out, or at least stated, with regard to how we read. So as Christian people, when we do come to the text, so a couple of things. I think it's chapter 3 of the book where I talk about how a basic reading of the Old Testament, particularly the Torah, depicts how God communicates through words. So if we read the Torah, we sort of do these readings of how God has communicated. God communicates in the Garden of Eden through an audible voice. Ultimately, we see God communicating with an audible voice from the heavens. Then we see Moses going up to the heavens and God communicating with the anthropomorphic finger, so a written word. And then finally the people, around this time, the people of Israel are like, don't ever let God speak to us again from the mountain, right?
Yeah, Exodus 19 there, that's fun. Yep.
Yeah, they say, okay, Moses, you go up, he tells you, then we do exactly. So by doing that, what they're saying is, Moses, you will function essentially as the voice of God in our community. And then some of that which Moses hears from God, Moses writes down. So then we have Moses functioning as a prophet in his community through the written word of God. So basically, in our reading of this, in our theological reading of this, one of the things that we're left with is that God is a verbal God whose written word is equally authoritative as his audible voice, as well as the message that came through the prophets. Now, some of this I've picked up from really some of the Reformed writers, especially John Frame, who
totally,
in his Doctrine of the Word of God book. But the point is that seems to be that's how we read these texts theologically, right? Yeah. Okay. Now, having said that, what we end up doing is we apply this theological paradigm to different sections of the Scripture, and we conclude that if this is all God's written word, then it's all equally authoritative, it's all equally inspired, right? That's very important, because that influences our reading of these texts that supposedly don't apply to us. Because in actuality, if the texts are equally authoritative, if they're equally inspired, there's something there that God wants to say to all of the audiences that have been privy to reading this.
Yep.
Now, those are some theological presuppositions that we just have to admit, right? We're not going into this going like, oh, maybe that section was not really inspired. Maybe that's not how we're approaching this. I mean, it's just important for us to admit that as we talk about your question. Your question now isn't, I think the way I can answer it is not about do these texts apply or not, but rather what in the world are we doing as readers to facilitate the application of the theological principles?
It kind of feels bogging down, too detail-oriented, and it's like, this is just not the world we live in.
Yeah, so the issue ends up being not now what we believe about the text, because we believe it's inspired, it's authoritative, it's for us, but rather what are we doing as readers to facilitate our understanding of these principles and apply our understanding of these principles? And here's one of the things. I think, first and foremost, as it relates to these difficult sections of the Torah especially, that we are not sufficiently reading them as part of ancient Israel's narrative. We get caught up frequently in the individual laws and what is right, and we don't recognize that we have a narrative in the Torah that's telling us a story, and part of that story is indeed the giving of these laws. So instead of being so sort of, such an, I guess we could say, right, an egocentric reader, like, what does this have to do with me? What does it have to do with me? Rather, how can we perceive more about the character of God based upon this revelation? How can we then be moved to action in our contemporary lives by reading about the character of God, the nature of God in these narratives? Like, what if we read like that instead of thinking, oh, the weird Levirate thing, that wouldn't go in our society. Circumcision, not that one. Instead of thinking that way, what if we understood this as a big story of which the giving of these weird parts is part of that story?
Yeah, that's good.
So for maybe defining terms that we didn't even mention, but I'm just going to go out on a limb and see if what we're talking about is hermeneutics or somewhat closely associated.
All right, couple of things, but let's make these sound bites because I haven't been good at that so far. So here comes a couple sound bites. This, I think everything relates to hermeneutics.
Yeah.
All of it. But the issue that I've had with typical hermeneutics classes is that they don't incorporate a sufficient amount of content,
Yep.
and what they tend to do is they tend to impose contemporary ideas of genre on biblical texts.
100%. Here's the rules to follow. Follow these rules,
Here
and
are
be
the
a better
rules to
reader.
follow. Exactly. What we actually do is we engage with genre as well, and texts engage in genre. So, like, what genre is the Book of Job? Like, how many people have asked that over the past, 2,500 years?
Yeah.
What genre is it, right? So we can talk about Job, but we can't talk about Job well. We can talk about the contents of Job, but we can't talk about the contents of Job well unless we talk about how to engage the prologue, which is clearly a different genre than Job's monologue, which is even a little bit different than even the dialogues that Job ends up having with his friends. Then we have another monologue later on. We have the speeches from the worldway, and then we have an epilogue that's very clearly narrative again. So what genre is Job? So we cannot talk about the contents of Job unless we talk about how Job was written and how we should engage in the writing. So Old Testament classes, in my opinion, by the way, I teach hermeneutics and Old Testament, right? So this is where this book came out of.
Yeah.
I think hermeneutics classes traditionally focus a bit too much on dividing up the genres and providing rules. They're imposed upon, in my opinion, frequently. And then Old Testament classes focus very much on providing facts, dates, what happened here and there. It's information you can get from a study Bible. But what we don't focus on lots, and this is where the book came from, and I'm getting excited. This is where the book came from. What is taking, like, fundamentally addressing how we read these inspired texts and combining it with the information that we get from these texts to be able to interpret and apply these texts well.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, cool. So this is kind of based on maybe a perception of Old Testament being somewhat esoteric and, not having people have a hard time digest it. So Old Testament history might be really fun to read. We've all, even since Sunday school, remember, stories of Noah's Ark and Moses
David and Goliath,
and
all that stuff. Yeah.
David and Goliath. And there's a lot of good, fun stories, I guess, that people know of. But more often than not, we wonder, how does this add in any way to the redemptive storyline? And I know that this could be more of a covenantal kind of structure, and knowing how, like you said, how it the point number 2, successive, which is revealing revelation and how it's moving forward. How do we as Christians read this when it seems so foreign to the New Testament?
Yeah, so that's right. There are some sections of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible that we can draw a direct line, like a very short direct line, with the culmination in the person and the work of Jesus the Messiah. Mm-hmm. There are some sections where we can simply just do that, right? And then there are other sections, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes.
Yeah.
There are other sections or some of the non-Messianic Psalms. You mentioned Psalms earlier. There's certain sections of the Bible where either we have to default to some sort of hermeneutic that permits us to maybe look at, let's say, trying to stray away from any words that might be taken the wrong way, but maybe a hermeneutic that is not that understands the text intentionally in a more Christological way, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or we have a little bit of a problem. All right, so if we're reading Christotelically, I guess we could say, and we come to these sections that do not have prophecy in them, or they're not, for example, depicting a direct lineage of Jesus, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah. Lots of texts do mention these types of things, and lots of texts can be considered prophetic if we're understanding prophetic in a certain type of way. But lots of texts also aren't like that. So what do we do? Well, a couple of things. I actually think it's how can I say this? The following thing I think is underappreciated by Christian readers of the Old Testament. What I think we do is we do recognize that Christ is the ultimate, like the culmination of the revelation of God. Mm-hmm. And so we want to read everything pointing in a very direct way to Christ. Okay, so sometimes that causes us to compromise even our own established hermeneutics, right?
Yep.
But what if we read these Old Testament texts and let them stand where they're at to help us grasp more the character of God?
Yep.
Isn't that ultimately, isn't it a really good thing to read biblical texts and permit them to tell us more about God's character? How about if we read these biblical texts and we recognize through a close reading of them how God relates to God's creation? Mm-hmm. That's also another. So it isn't the only. Sometimes we read these texts and we think the only valid way to read these is if they eventually tell us what Jesus did on the cross. And there are many texts that do that in a direct line, but some texts do this. There's a perforated line, they go in circles and the like, because what they're doing is they're revealing to us the character of God. They're revealing to us how God interacts with God's creation. They're telling us about a characteristic about God. They're showing us how God works behind the scenes in salvation history. There are texts that just speak to how good our God is. That's a sufficient reading, I think. Mm-hmm. Instead of trying everything, even in many ways, artificially, trying to make things artificially seem as if they're in this very neat order of salvation history.
Yeah, and I think that's also it's a good way of, I think, bridging to this as well, because we talked about this beginning, because I think Psalms, I think we tend to think we're better readers of the Psalms than we actually are. But my question is, can we go a little bit deeper in our Psalms reading than I think most people are used to? And instead of it's good stuff. It helps us in times of need and lament and praising and all this great stuff. But what are some elements of biblical poetry that those reading in English, and if you can read in Hebrew, that you can utilize to maybe get deeper, like you said, into the text, what the text is saying, and how does this maybe apply to wisdom literature also in general?
Right. So there's a couple of things. I forget who said this, but someone said, you might be able to tell me who said it, poetry is that which can't be translated. Are you familiar with that quote?
I do know the quote. I can't think of who said it. Yeah.
And I, but anyway, I agree with that. So to a certain extent, right? In biblical Hebrew poetry, in our English Bibles, and by the way, this is not an elitist exercise.
No,
I'm not saying such things to be an elitist. What I am going to do right now is point out a couple of things that challenge us in our interpretation because of distances.
Yeah.
So in our English translations or Spanish or whatever the mother language is that the listeners read, if it's not the biblical Hebrew, and by the way, there are no contemporary native biblical Hebrew speakers, right? And there's different types.
So
of
all of us
Hebrew.
have some sort of distance, whether or not you could read
all
Hebrew.
Of us, exactly. All of us have some sort of distance. But the point is, we come to biblical Hebrew and we're like, oh, I get the gist. This is awesome. This moves me. Why? Because semantics, meanings of words and phrases in biblical Hebrew can be adequately translated to different languages, right? We know for the most part what lots of words and phrases meant in biblical Hebrew. We're able to provide the gist in different translations as to what it meant. That can be translated. But a couple of things can't be translated. Mm-hmm. They're just lost in translation. So, and there are two main things I'll focus on here. First, we can see in our broken up in sort of the copy edited broken up lines in biblical Hebrew that in our English language translations that the modern translations tend to try to separate these lines into thought segments or whatever. Yep. Well, it's very obvious in biblical Hebrew poetry that one of the main components, one of the main ways to identify poetry is the proliferation of parallelism. Yep. So there are two or three or maybe more lines sometimes, adjacent lines that relate to each other in some sort of way. Now, we can normally understand the semantic meaning of these lines. So we can normally be like, oh, I see how they relate. But they relate in other ways. Like sometimes in biblical Hebrew, they relate phonetically, like how they sound. And sometimes there is something like rhyming. Other times there's alliteration. There's plenty of other phonetic ways. Morphology, they relate in how they change words. There's different types of way that lines.
It's not even what they're saying, but it's how they're saying it is also a beautiful
it's
way.
inseparable, in my opinion. It really is inseparable from deriving meaning and principles, even though the language can be translated.
Yeah, totally.
That's one side, the parallelism. Another way in which we can recognize biblical Hebrew poetry in the Psalms, but also this is prevalent in the Proverbs, a poetic type of literature, is the proliferation of metaphor. Now again, metaphor, the semantics of many metaphors can be translated. You can get the sort of the meaning in English, like what are the words meaning? But sometimes we are lacking as contemporary readers the source domain information for the metaphor. So we kind of don't exactly know what a metaphor is representing one concept in terms of another. So sometimes we struggle with the principal concept, like what exactly is this being compared to? Yeah, what is it referring to? So some of them are intuitive for us. But some of them we've just sort of lost information as it relates to
like Song of Solomon is one of those metaphors. Like, I have no idea what he's talking about now.
Well, in the Song of Solomon, there is lots of metaphors that we're kind of like, what does this one mean? But we also see several in the Proverbs.
Yeah.
We're kind of like, okay, why is the author comparing it to that? And I would say a good amount also in the book of Job.
That's right. And maybe just so we can kind of get into, because I know Job is kind of like your that's your right hook. That's the thing you've done most of your scholarly work on. Maybe just some help on, obviously not everything on Job, but some grappling things that people can help them a little bit more reading through Job, because a lot of people are like, oh, it's just about divine sovereignty, or it's just about suffering, or it's just about like how do we put these two together? Maybe help us a little bit on some wisdom literature with Job.
Well, anytime anyone says to you, Job is just about, ignore the rest of what they're going to say. It's not just about.
Like a series on divine suffering or on human suffering through the book of Job.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was joking. Obviously, we can say Job is about, but normally about, in the biblical books, as you all know, in the biblical books, we can say sort of a main theme is, and we can teach to that, we can even preach to that. But when we analyze these things, we recognize that there are many books that have several threads running through them. In fact, I would say to a certain extent, we could say all books have several threads running through them. So in Job, we don't just see, one thread. And it's difficult to say that the whole book is about human suffering, mostly because Job never gets an answer to why he's actually suffering. Yeah. If we're supposed to read this to understand something about human suffering, we're going to get the same answer that Job got.
Yeah. And it's all restored at the end. So it's like he suffered, obviously, but like he got it all back, and more so at the end.
Right, which brings into question the issue of just retribution. Yeah. Because if Job just gets everything back at the end because he's good, then good people get good stuff and bad people get bad stuff eventually. Yeah. That's just how it works. And that's one of the things that is called into question in Job chapters 1 and 2. But I'll just say in terms of Job, there's a couple of things. First of all, as readers, we have to recognize as readers, we have to recognize that we are given privileged information in chapters 1 and 2.
Stuff Job doesn't know.
Stuff Job and his friends don't know.
Right.
Yep. What does that mean? That means that we are privileged to look into the rest of the composition to the epilogue and make judgments based upon what we know in the prologue.
Yeah.
That's a big deal. And that is why is that a big deal? Well, I'm going to tell you briefly, as quickly as I possibly can. Cut out whatever you want, I guess. But I'm going to just tell you briefly, okay? Yeah. Why is that a big deal? Here's why this is a big deal. It's a big deal because the way that Job is written can facilitate contemporary readers, especially, understanding some of the proverbial sounding adages, phrases, and think that they are, Job especially, and his friends even especially, saying good things. When in actuality, the friend speech is condemned at the end.
Yep.
All right. So yeah, right. So what's happening here? Well, the privileged information is sort of like we are told what's going on to a certain extent so that we're able to learn from the embedded mistakes of the interlocutors during the composition or during the book. So we see these people going back and forth for 3 rounds ish.
Yep.
And we hear them talking about just retribution and several other themes. And they're sounding in many ways very biblical, like other sections of the Bible, like Proverbs. We're able to say, that doesn't apply in this situation. That's misunderstood in this situation. That's not actually the right type of proverb, right? Like, we're able to do that as readers.
Yeah.
That, I think, actually is one of the main points of reading the book.
Yeah.
Not just right? Being able to discern when wisdom adages, particularly biblical wisdom adages, are used in the proper context and therefore applicable.
Yeah, which is helpful in the way that you give those 4 kind of principles at the beginning of your book, obviously, and then it helps us engage with Job, because we know Job 1 and 2 is stuff that the friends in Job don't know. That we can. It helps our interpretive process versus just saying, like, I'm going to read this 1 through 42, and I'm going to learn a little bit about divine suffering and learn a little or human suffering and divine sovereignty and stuff. Versus, like, okay, how is this book telling me it wants me to read the book, and in a better and more faithful way to what the author wanted us to get.
Yeah, and since my last at bat, I made contact on that hermeneutics thing, got a base hit. I'm gonna go up to bat again and say for the Job context, the Job context with the friends. Would you say that Job's friends had a really poor eisegesis?
I don't put things in those terms. Here's what I would say about Job's friends. By the way, this could still be a base hit for you if it works out.
I'll run it out. I'm fast.
But I don't tend to put things in those terms. Here's what I would say.
Okay.
I would say that Job's friends seem to base their system of consistent just retribution on traditional wisdom that we even see in other areas of the Bible. Yep. So it's very clear in other areas of the Bible that God does teach that there is just retribution.
Yeah. Lex talionis principle in Deuteronomy.
We see this type of thing, like just retribution, and most explicitly stated in these individual adages that we see through the book of Proverbs. But what we also see, especially in Proverbs, and especially by the juxtaposition of these Proverbs that look like they contradict each other, is that wisdom is not just the memorization of the adages, but it's also wisdom incorporates a knowledge as to when to apply these adages. And so we have, for example, in Proverbs 26, 4 and 5, answer a fool according to his folly, don't answer a fool according to his folly. Like, do you think the editor of the book of Proverbs didn't know that we're saying the exact same thing?
Yeah.
They are saying the exact same thing, but in one situation, one applies and the other it doesn't. Well, what Job's friends do, and they do this especially by way of utilizing light-darkness imagery, in my opinion. They say things like, Job says, I want darkness because I want to rest. And Job's friends eventually say, like, that's not what darkness is set out for. Darkness is a punishment for wicked people. It means death, basically. Job's like, no, it means rest. And then Bildad comes in 18 and he's like, the lamp of the wicked wanes. And we're like, wait, I've seen that before. And we look in the book of Proverbs and it shows up 3 times. The lamp of the wicked will wane. And literally 3 times in the book of Proverbs. So, is Proverbs wrong? Because, right? Of course not.
Yeah, they're reading the Bible, but are they applying it well?
What we know, because of Job 1 and 2, that the lamp of the wicked waning is not applicable in Job's situation because Job's not wicked. So why is God saying that to him? Yeah. So Job then comes back in chapter 1 and he says, how frequently do you see the lamp of the wicked waning? Basically saying, hey, look, that doesn't happen consistently. And the implication, I think, is that if the lamp of the wicked doesn't always consistently wane, then this idea that there's a consistent system of just retribution, consistent universal system of just retribution also doesn't exist on this earth. That's, I think, what Job is getting at there. So again, there's lots of conversations going on in the book of Job. We have to let those conversations we have to let them coexist with one another and receive as readers what the text is telling us in many different threads.
So discernment is key.
Well, what we see from the book of Job is that Job's friends, sounding lots like traditional wisdom, misapplied that traditional wisdom in Job's situation. And we know this as readers. So we can see that the book was written for readership, right? It was intended for us to be able to look at this situation and go, oh, no, don't say that. That's not, sounds like a proverb, but it isn't, right? So this is why, and again, I'm not a hater, nor am I an elitist. But I highly recommend, like, doing for people that read passages before a service to get people excited about the service. Like, stay away from Job's friends because they might sound like the Proverbs, right? Right. But God condemns their speech, and it's that speech specifically when they're interacting with Job that's eventually condemned. Because they utilize what sounds like traditional adages, traditional wisdom, the Word of God. It sounds very much like the Word of God to create a system of fixed just retribution. And God says, that's not good. Don't use my word and my name to do that.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't apply in Job's situation.
Yeah, and this might be a little extreme to say, but every heretic has their favorite verse. So people. Yeah,
and mine is just. I'm just kidding.
Totally. Yeah, but and maybe I think this helps. So my last question, and especially as we look towards speech, and I think again when we look at the prophets, like they're speakers, they talk. We think they only ever talk about the future. They're only just prophesiers about the future. But is that all they look at? Is that all that they're functioning as? And maybe how do they also uniquely, like you talk about, they weave poetry and prose together, Southern Kingdom, Northern Kingdom. So they do a lot of things that if we try to just put them in the future box, we don't catch what they say all the way. Yeah,
right. So first of all, we have a little bit of different understanding in the Christian scriptures and the Christian viewing of the Old Testament as to what a prophet is. Many times we think prophet, boom, we think prophecy, right? Yep. And by the way, this is not to say that there isn't prophecy.
It's not. We're not saying they don't do it. It's not the only thing they do.
They also judge.
And Nick, you mentioned the word esoteric, earlier as it related to parts of the Torah. I would say many people view the prophets just as like these esoteric. There's sort of this. Lots of them are these mystical beings, and they see weird things. They see monsters. It seems like flying saucers, some might say, this type of stuff, right? And we're kind of like, whoa, But I think one of the reasons why we struggle sometimes to read the prophets is because we do think that they are, we sort of push their messages into the future, and we don't privilege or we don't appreciate them as most excellent poets in many cases.
Oh yeah.
Let me just pause there and say, another thing that's important to recognize is that prophetic literature isn't exclusively poetic. Prophetic literature isn't exclusively poetic. I'm not sure if I said that. Mm-hmm. In many cases, we read of the actions of a prophet, even the prophet dialoguing with people, and to a certain extent, we also consider those sections prophetic literature. So we can't think, okay, prophetic literature means that the prophet is telling the future, because we actually don't really mean that about all the texts that we would consider to be prophetic texts. There's sections of Isaiah, for example, that are narrative, very clearly narrative, right?
Yeah.
So that's the distinction. But prophetic literature is not exclusively narrative, exclusively poetic. When we encounter either the narrative, we read those narratives with the principles with which we engage in narrative, and when we encounter poetic literature, we engage that poetic literature with the principles that we would normally utilize, the hermeneutical principles that we normally utilize to engage poetic literature.
I'm thinking of Nathan the prophet. Sometimes and a lot of times the prophet is just telling someone that they're screwing up right now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
They're not just saying like
Lincoln's
you're going to
this
screw up in the
one.
future. They're like, yeah, you screwed up right now.
No, it's actually happening right now. You're screwing
Yeah.
up.
Oh yeah, and Elijah is his ministry is very
Yep.
much like that, right? I remind us as Christian people that our Jewish friends actually believe that some of like they call those books prophetic books, right?
Yeah.
The former prophets. So for us as Christian people, we tend to think that the mostly poetic prophets. So there's a couple that aren't completely poetic, like Jonah, for example. But we tend to think that what many would call the minor prophets are really the prophetic books, whereas the prophets that many of our Jewish
Isaiah,
friends
Jeremiah,
would call,
Ezekiel,
right?
like we think, yeah,
Well,
those
even
guys.
before that, so even before that, like First, Second Samuel.
Okay,
right,
yeah. Former
we
prophets.
tend to think, but in actuality, we do read repeatedly in these books, for example, in the case of Elijah and Elisha,
Yeah.
human beings receiving the word of God, delivering that word of God. In that sense, we can say that these texts are most certainly prophetic, though they're not poetic.
Yeah.
Very cool. And to wrap it up, let's talk about Isaiah 52 to 53. Huge chapters in the Old Testament. And you were talking about it in the last chapter of your book, the case study on the servant song. What are you aiming for in this chapter, and how can we read this consecutively, which is one of your 4 principles, and within its own context, as well as grappling it with how the New Testament authors read it? Because Isaiah 53 is huge.
Christians are licking their chops. Like this is our bread and butter.
Yeah, Isaiah
This is our
53.
bread and butter as Christians. Look, I'm not denying that this is our bread and butter as Christians, but here's what I'm trying to do here. I think I admit this in the chapter. We cannot separate ourselves as Christians from our Christianity. Let's not pretend that we can. What we can do is we can be humble readers. We can intentionally create spaces for us to be teachable. So, and sometimes when we do this, we have to be open to changing our readings or interpretations of certain passages. I wrote this a very short chapter in a book called Hebrew for Life, book academic. And in that, I call it the double-edged sword of biblical languages. And part of the point of this is that if we study biblical Hebrew, if we study biblical languages in general, sometimes when we love it, we get into the nitty-gritty of text, and that's a good thing. That's one side of the awesome sword, right? We're able to divide the text well, to use that metaphor. But the other side is that sometimes it pierces closely held interpretations that we have of passages. That is, when we're able to read the text in its language, sometimes we have to be able to sort of cut out a bad interpretation and start anew. And so what I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, look, we've talked this whole book about how to be deliberate readers. I'm not trying to pretend I don't know what New Testament writers are doing with this text. What I would like to do, however, is to say, can we be good readers of the text in its context, and still come to the same conclusions that the New Testament writers came to? Not only that, but this is another key for us as New Testament readers. Sometimes as New Testament readers, we're like, oh, look it. He was the author saying that's a prediction. When in actuality, many times what the author is doing is looking at a pattern and not necessarily a futuristic prophecy.
Yep, totally.
That happens in the New Testament, right? Where we see these patterns being made bigger and then ultimately fulfilled. So what I want to do is say, hey, how are we actually, look, Christians, we know that there's something to this, but are we reading this well? And I hope that the representative, I did this a little bit. It's not comprehensive in this chapter, but that, by representing a couple of different voices and a couple of different opinions as to how this could be interpreted by faithful interpreters, I just say, hey, it's reasonable to suggest that this is maybe not as open and shut as we thought it was, and maybe what the New Testament writers are doing isn't exactly what we thought they were doing either.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to get at here.
Yeah, and I think maybe it's for our audience too, to simplify it for them. It's I think a lot of us, like, we have the answer, so like everything gets filtered through the answers. Like, okay, the answer here, answer this, versus like, well, how did they get there? Like, let's show their work.
Right. That, you know what? Scratch what I just said and just add what you said, because that's precisely it, right? I mean, we can look, but none of us actually believe that that's the right way to almost do anything. We actually believe that processes facilitate a deeper and more committed understanding to truth.
Yeah.
So we don't just jump to the right answer for a mathematics problem, right? I'm going to go home and do mathematic homework with my son. But we actually believe that going through the process and utilizing the formulas and plugging in the variables and all of that is a better way of coming to even a conclusion. And sometimes we come to different conclusions, or we understand with more profundity exactly why the conclusion was reached. Yeah. That's really what I'm doing here.
So it fills it out, and then when you read what they're doing in the New Testament, like it expands what they're doing. Like, you see more of what they're doing. I was like, I see how you got there, and now that I see how you got there, I see what's happening with Jesus, what's happening with any one of these prophecies that was here, and it's a pattern. I see this in a bigger way than I would have just seen. It's like, oh, that's Jesus here, and then that's Jesus here too. That's great, kind of like 1-to-1 ratio. It's not like you want to see the buildup, you want to see the tension, and then how they unfold this in the New Testament in a deeper, more profound way.
Because you want to almost walk with them as they're writing it in their real time. You go back in time with them and walk through it with them. Right. And like you're saying, if you start with the answer,
which is hard, which is why you said you need deliberate, slow approach.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if you start with the answer and you try to over filter it first, you almost flatten the question.
Yeah.
And oversimplify the question.
There are. So this is an example in which we do this, and so I think, for example, the lamb imagery that we see in Isaiah 53, it's very clear. I mean, at least to me, when scholars say it's very clear, that means it's not that clear, right? But it's kind of clear to me that Isaiah is playing on this Passover tradition.
Oh yeah.
This lamb. It seems that way, right? We see that Isaiah is a very clear middle step between the Passover and the New Testament, and what the New Testament writers say. The New Testament writers flesh the imagery out much more for us. Even even John's comment to Jesus, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Like, we as people that have been in church for many years, we're kind of like, oh, I get it, sacrificial. Like, think about why is he calling Jesus a lamb, right?
Yeah.
Like, what does that mean, take away the sin of the world? What's happening? So that's one thing. But also, and this is, I don't touch on this actually in the book, but this is another thing that Christians will be familiar with, and hopefully they'll get an understanding as to why I'm trying to trace some of these motifs, and that is the mention of Melchizedek in the Psalms, right?
Yep.
That's another one, right? So we have this Torah reference to Melchizedek, then we have the psalmist bringing up Melchizedek, and then we have Melchizedek showing up in the book of Hebrews. Now, then we also have 11Q Melchizedek in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have mentions of Melchizedek.
We had Matt Amati on for his book on Melchizedek and Psalm 110. Yeah, so he went through all this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. So again, we see that the New Testament writer is using an image. We can't just say, oh, fulfilled prophecy, Old Testament. He was predicting exactly. But sometimes they're being creative. Sometimes they're utilizing patterns. They're demonstrating the culmination of certain symbolism. Just want to figure out what they're doing by giving the first text, or the more original text, we could say, the Old Testament text, its proper dues in its context.
Yeah, and I'd say the Holy Spirit knew what he was doing, so revealing only so much to the human author at that time while they were writing, which as New Testament writers now we know more. And we as New Testament readers, we see now how brilliantly it grew to completion. And now that the New Testament scriptures are revealed to us and we see the finished work of Christ. So even Isaiah 53, we're like, wow, that was brilliant. And the human author at the time was just writing what the Holy Spirit at that time was revealing to him.
Yeah, I would say, what I forget exactly what this quote is in the book, but I quote Walter Kaiser's idea of this whole idea of there being something in a seed form initially. And I think that we see this repeatedly throughout the Old Testament. And that's why, to go back to your question, Nick, the progressive reading is important, because a seed is a point in time. You see a seed in a point in time. But a seed flourishes, right? It eventually grows. But you can't look at just the seed or the stalk. But if you see the seed and you just have to remember that you're looking at this in terms of a process. You're not going to be able to see the flower from the very beginning, but you can still learn something as the seed flourishes.
Yeah.
And you can still apply principles as the seed flourishes. You don't just look at the flower, right? And so I think in our reading of the Old Testament, in our reading of passages like the ones that we've talked about today, it's important to recognize, as we're progressive readers, that we can still learn as something is flourishing, which we see repeatedly in different areas of the Old Testament. We're at a period of time here. We're learning what we can about this particular section of our reading. There's more to come.
Yeah.
Man, if we had more time, we would ask about Daniel 7.
Yes,
and a lot more. A lot. Yeah, Daniel 7 is a hard. He went for the jugular right away.
Yeah.
He did go for the jugular, but are you saying we ran out of time? Because that's fine with me if this is what you want to talk about now.
If you could sum it up maybe in like two minutes or a minute, sure. But other than that,
impossible.
Yeah, I know. It is impossible. But it was like, that's a huge one.
Yeah.
Is Daniel 7.
Well, why do you bring up Daniel 7 now? I don't get the connection to what.
I was just thinking of like future eschatology, tying in end times stuff, going towards, people a lot of times bring up Daniel 7.
Nick likes the end times a lot.
I see. Well, here's what I'll say just very briefly about the reading of passages like Daniel 7. The fact that there may be futuristic elements in those passages don't necessarily negate what can be learned in the here or now. And I think that's what the here and now. And I think that's what Peter was also getting at with one of his questions, right? So it does. I mean, Christian people tend to think that there are futuristic elements to certain prophecies, that there are indeed what we would call predictions. So that's not, many Christians would not dispute that. What we would dispute is how to approach these hermeneutically so that we can continue to learn about the here and now. Yep. And that's where I think, if I can just reiterate what I've said very briefly, the idea of reading to recognize the characteristics of God displayed through a particular text, and how God relates to humankind, how God even will relate to humankind, how God relates to his creation. Those types of things, I think, are undervalued principles of reading. We frequently try to take things to what we consider to be the culmination. So we'll try to, make this an altar call or whatever it might be. But sometimes, no, really. I mean, sometimes what can move human beings is recognizing the characteristics of our great God that are depicted holistically, not in its entirety, but holistically through the written word. And I think if we focus on this in our preaching and our teaching, we focus on how good our God is as displayed through we'll have a better idea of who God is, and that will indeed bring people into his truth. He will use that, right, to bring people 100%. into his truth, and to be even more lovers of the word.
Cool. Awesome. Well, I love it. Well, Dr. Hernandez, thank you so much for coming on, for writing this book, for being a nerd on Semitic philology, and helping others to become the nerds in the same thing, because it just helps us be better readers of the Bible and see some of these patterns and texts and all these great things and textures, which makes us better readers of the Bible ourselves. So thanks for writing this, and thanks for all the work that you do.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. What a great conversation. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Of course.